Okay.
So, the Red-Headed League is actually the second of the Sherlock Holmes short stories behind Scandal in Bohemia, but I personally think that Scandal is such an unusual story. It probably should be treated as its separate subject. There isn't really a mystery involved, it's much more of a drama, which makes it closer to the novels than to the short stories. So, for all intents and purposes, the Red-Headed League is the first real Sherlock Holmes short story, published in August 1891. So our client is Jabez Wilson, and he is pretty much the most ordinary, unimpressive nobody you could ever imagine. He's not well educated, he doesn't appear to have any particular skills, he's not a particularly attractive person. The only thing that's noticeable about him is his bright red hair. He owns a pawn shop, and he is a bachelor. He has no wife and no kids. He is a terrible hermit. He spends most of his day either at home or at the shop. He never goes out, he never socializes. He's a loner. Back a few years ago, before the Depression, he was able to have a reasonably strong shop. He had two assistants, but then he has had to lay them off, and so now he just has one assistant and a girl who does the cleaning and cooking. And this assistant is a very odd person. His name is Vincent Spaulding, and he has been willing to work at half pay. And so Jabez was very delighted to be able to have an assistant who would only be interested in taking half a wage. But there's more odd things about Vincent. He is incredibly clever, unusually clever, and it's kind of weird that there's some kid who's so talented and clever would be working at a pawn shop. And rather than try and learn any profession or trade, Vincent spends a lot of time in the basement working on his amateur photography work. So everything came to a head one day when our assistant, Vincent, approached Jabez with a ad that he had seen in the recent newspaper, which talked about an opening that was available in what was called the League of Red-Headed Gentlemen. And all you would have to do is go down to Fleet Street and apply for the position. And it took an enormous amount of coaxing and convincing for Jabez to be willing to leave his shop and go all the way into mainstream London to actually apply for this job. When they got there was an enormous crowd, hundreds and hundreds of red-haired men all applying for this one job at the Red-Headed League. And the director of this league was a man named Duncan Ross. And something very odd happened. So even though there were hundreds of red-headed men who all could have easily applied for this one position, for some reason, the director, Duncan Ross, picked out Jabez, just eyeballed him and said, "This is my man. This is the guy who needs to have the job." And he called him up and said, "Congratulations, you're now a member of the Red-Headed League of Gentlemen." So this job requires you being in this office in Fleet Street every day from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And you get £4 per week, which is an enormous amount of money. And considering that Jabez's pawn shop is not doing particularly well, it's the kind of money he really would like to have. And what does he need to do? He just needs to sit there at the desk and write out entries from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And there's just one rule: never leave the room. As long as you are in the room from 10 to 2 and you are writing out the Encyclopedia Britannica, you will get £4 per week. Now, at first, when he started this new position, the director, Duncan Ross, went in to check on him regularly. But then, after a week, he did it every so often, and then within the next week, he didn't bother checking at all. Duncan Ross completely trusted that Jabez would do the job that he was being asked to do. So, this went on for 8 weeks, and then suddenly Jabez went to Fleet Street, to the office, to commence another day of work, and he found that the door had been locked, and there was a sign on the door that said, "The League of Red-Headed Gentlemen has been disbanded." And he was really confused how he'd been earning so much money and doing so much work for the last 8 weeks, and suddenly it all had gone away. And he was rather frustrated by how he hadn't been told about any of this. He went to the landlord and said, what's happened to the Red-Headed League? And the landlord had no idea what was going on. And he asked, what about Mr. Duncan Ross? Who's never heard of that. It appears that Duncan Ross was just a pseudonym for this particular man who had rented this office for this last 8 weeks. He asked about a forwarding address, but it was a fake forwarding address. So this man, Duncan Ross, had disappeared, and with it, this mysterious League of Red-Headed Gentlemen. So, we come to the issue at hand, which is the thing that I really like about so many of the Arthur Conan Doyle mysteries is how you actually deal with all of the evidence at hand and how you process it. The problem is that if you just assume that certain innocent people will behave in a particular way and guilty people will behave in a particular way, and then when an incident happens, you just sort of a priori fitting the facts to fit your model that already exists in your head, you start making presumptions and assumptions, and so then you start So, what the Sherlock Holmes stories often ask you to do is to not just look at the literal interactions, but to look at the meaning underneath the interactions. Because Jabez, what happened to him, doesn't make any sense. The Red-Headed League doesn't make any sense. Copying out the Encyclopedia Britannica doesn't make any sense. And so if you're trying to think about the literal evidence at hand and how it actually fits into any sort of criminal enterprise, it just can't work. And so instead, the Sherlock Holmes stories ask you to try to find the truth underneath the situation. What is actually going on behind all of this nonsense? And it usually has some sort of criminal nature. Perhaps you're trying to manufacture a witness to a situation, you're trying to have an alibi, you're trying to destroy evidence, dispose of a murder weapon, or something like that. Something that's underneath the actual incident. And so Sherlock was able to realize that Jabez's work at the Red-Headed League actually had a criminal intention, which was to get him out of his pawn shop and away for 4 hours every day. And then everything started to come together. So Sherlock and Watson went over to the town and started to visit. They saw the pawn shop, and Sherlock had a look at the shops nearby. He noticed that there was the pawn shop, there was the newspaper shop, there was a restaurant, and there was a nearby branch of a bank. He went over to the pawn shop and started tapping the pavement with his walking stick, trying to hear what he could hear about how the ground was. He went into the pawn shop and tried to have a talk with that assistant, Vincent Spaulding, and noticed that Vincent didn't have the marks of someone who had been performing amateur photography. Instead, his knees were covered in soot. Not what you would expect. So, suddenly things started to make sense. Why was this very clever boy willing to work as an assistant at a pawn shop for half the price? Why did he come in with this newspaper that just had the specific ad? And why, as soon as Jabez and Vincent showed up at Fleet Street, was Jabez immediately given the job? It was all too convenient. It was all too neat, which means it must have been contrived. There is some sort of goal behind all of this. And then it all clicked into place. Sherlock Holmes had realized what was going on. Get the guy out of his pawn shop and go down into the cellar and dig a tunnel underneath the road in order to break into the local bank. And Sherlock Holmes was also able to realize this director of the Red-Headed League was actually one John Clay, who was a master criminal, a thief, a murderer, who had been able to defy Sherlock's grasp many times previously. So, it was a Saturday night. This was the time for the heist, because the bank wouldn't open until Monday, and by then they would have made their getaway and they would be out of the country. So, Sherlock, Watson, the local police officer, Peter Jones, and the bank manager, Mr. Merriweather, all were in the bank cellar waiting for the two criminals to break through the remainder of the ground and get into the cellar to try to rob the bank. And as soon as those two criminals came through, there was a big scuffle, and so Sherlock and the police were able to arrest them. And so it was a successful counter heist. They were able to stop the bank robbery from happening. And so, like I said before, there are a lot of Sherlock Holmes short stories where nothing fits into any preconceived model of what a criminal enterprise is meant to look like. Things just aren't forming in the way that a normal criminal mind or a criminal pattern would. And the solution is not to try to force the facts to fit your model. Rather, it's a matter of letting the facts fit into whatever order they can naturally come about, actually being honest and letting the facts speak for themselves and seeing the pattern that they emerge, and then you will be able to see the criminal act that is lying underneath what would otherwise seem like really innocuous, silly, and unimportant events. So, I really adore the Red-Headed League. I think it is a marvellous debut for the Sherlock Holmes short stories.